Hey everyone, tonight, we're heading somewhere quiet, far from the noise of cities, screens, and the hum of electricity. Just settle in, maybe dim the lights, and imagine yourself sitting near a small fire. The air is cool, the stars stretch endlessly above you, and the only sound is the wind brushing through the tall grass. Tonight, we're traveling back long before highways or borders, to a world where movement wasn't a choice, it was life itself. This is the story of Native American life, not the battles or the Hollywood myths, but the quiet rhythms of travel, foraging, and the spirit that tied everything together. If you picture North America before European contact, don't imagine empty wilderness. Imagine an enormous, living map of people moving, trading, fishing, burning grasslands, planting corn, and carrying stories from mountain to coast. Tens of millions of people, across hundreds of nations, each one with its own ways of walking the earth. Some stayed in one place, farmers of the Mississippi River valleys, or the cliff dwellers of the Southwest. Others followed the herds and the seasons, always in motion. Life wasn't primitive, it was sophisticated, just not industrial. Let's start with that motion. For so many native peoples, movement wasn't just survival, it was the way of understanding time and space. To travel meant to follow life. Picture a Lakota family in the northern plains around the early 1600s. Before horses, their world was shaped by the rhythm of walking. They moved with dogs. Yes, before horses came from Europe, dogs were the main beasts of burden. They pulled wooden sleds called travois, loaded with hides, tools, and sleeping bundles. Traveling like that wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. Each movement had purpose. The people knew the land, every hill, every watering place. There was no map to unfold. The knowledge lived in stories. When elders told a story about a buffalo hunt or a sacred spring, it wasn't entertainment, it was geography, disguised as myth. Let's drift west for a moment, to the Great Basin. The Shoshone, Paiute, and Ute lived in some of the harshest lands on the continent. You couldn't farm there easily. Rain was scarce, and food came from the patience to notice small things. Pine nuts, seeds, rabbits, lizards, roots. Foraging wasn't random, scavenging, it was an art form. Each plant had its own season, each valley its own offering. The people moved in small groups, family-based, light on the land. You didn't hoard, you carried what you needed, and you knew where to find the rest when the time came. There's something oddly calming about that, isn't there? A world where the idea of owning nature would have sounded absurd. The land wasn't a resource, it was a relationship. Let's float north for a bit, up where the Pacific Northwest forests meet the sea. Life there was different. Food was so abundant that travel was measured by tides, not miles. The coastal peoples, the Haida, the Tlingit, the Salish, built great cedar canoes that could hold entire families and trade goods. They fished salmon runs, so thick that early settlers thought the rivers themselves were alive. Their canoes weren't just boats, they were sculptures, hollowed from single cedar trunks, carved with long, elegant lines that sliced through water like a moving shadow. Journeys were ceremonial. Traveling along the coast meant visiting relatives, exchanging songs, trading copper and shells, renewing friendships. And those massive cedar forests, they were grocery stores, hardware shops, and temples all at once. The same tree could provide a roof, a totem, a spoon, or a burial box. Let's glide inland now to the forests and lakes of the Northeast. The Iroquois, the Algonquin, the Ojibwe, people whose worlds were shaped by the balance between hunting, farming, and fishing. Summers were full of cornfields, beans, and squash. The Three Sisters. Winters meant long journeys on snowshoes, hunting deer or beaver, sometimes moving camps entirely. For them, travel was cyclical. The same routes, the same places, visited generation after generation. Trails weren't random paths. Many of today's modern highways follow those ancient routes, laid out with quiet precision centuries ago. The Iroquois Confederacy, that powerful alliance of nations, didn't just travel for survival, they traveled for diplomacy. Messengers carried wampum belts, each one a code of memory, a pattern of beads that told stories, laws, and agreements. Imagine delivering history itself, woven into strings of shell beads. Now, as night deepens, let's move south, down into the deserts and mesas of the Southwest. Life here was older, denser. The Hopi, the Zuni, the Pueblo peoples had built villages of adobe and stone long before Europeans appeared. Farming in dry land wasn't easy. but they learned to read the land like a living text. They watched how the rain fell, where it lingered, how the wind carved the soil. Fields were placed where nature cooperated. Crops grew in spiral patterns, holding moisture, shaded by stones. Foraging still mattered: cactus fruit, mesquite beans, wild herbs. Travel was done on foot, through heat that could melt sanity. But they did it calmly, methodically, like a slow breath. Spiritually, travel was never just movement, it was ceremony. Each path had meaning. Each direction, north, south, east, west, carried symbolism. In many native traditions, traveling wasn't about leaving home, but returning to balance. The spirit world wasn't far away, it was layered over the physical one. When someone journeyed to gather plants or follow the buffalo, it was as much spiritual as practical. The land was alive, not metaphorically, but literally. The stones, the rivers, the trees, all had voices. That belief shaped behavior. When you took a plant, you left tobacco or a prayer. When you hunted an animal, you thanked its spirit. The balance was delicate. Take too much, and the world noticed. Now, we might think of that as superstition, but it was also ecology long before the word existed. The system worked. It kept the balance between need and greed. Let's pause for a second and breathe that in. Imagine that rhythm: travel, gather, move, rest. No engines, no alarms, just the quiet choreography of survival. At night, stories filled the silence. Every group had storytellers, not performers exactly, but keepers of memory. They spoke of how the world began, how the animals chose their shapes, how humans were meant to live. These stories weren't just for entertainment, they were education, religion, and law in one. The young listened because the old told stories that mattered, stories that explained why you moved, where you went, and how you treated what you found. And when you think about it, that's the real journey, not across land, but across generations. Let's float to one more scene before we drift into part 2. It's late autumn on the plains. The air smells like frost and wood smoke. A small band prepares to move camp. They've used up the nearby firewood. The herds have moved on, and the wind carries new signs. Women pack dried meat and tools. Men take down lodge poles. Children chase the dogs that will pull the The sky opens wide, pink, gold, endless. And as the people start walking, there's no rush. They're not leaving. They're simply continuing. Travel, for them, wasn't escape or conquest. It was rhythm, the heartbeat of existence. And that's where we'll leave them for tonight, walking across the land they know like an old song. In the next part, we'll look deeper at how food, spirit, and season tied everything together, how foraging wasn't just survival, but a form of prayer in motion. So take a slow breath, let the fire fade, and rest easy. We'll continue this journey soon. If you're still awake, good. If not, well, that's the point. Either way, let's quietly slip back into the old world, where the land itself was the calendar. For most native peoples, time wasn't measured in months or numbers. It was measured in things that moved, in the salmon that returned, the berries that ripened, the first frost that glittered on the grass. Each season wasn't just weather, it was an invitation. The year began differently, depending on where you lived. For the Ojibwe, it started with the maple sap run, the moment when cold days gave way to warmth, and trees began to weep sweetness. Families moved to the sugar bush, tapping trunks with careful cuts, and setting bark containers below. The work was slow, sticky, and quietly joyful. Children licked the drips straight from the spiles, because of course they did. And when the syrup was done, it wasn't just food, it was the taste of renewal. Further west, among the Great Plains tribes, the turning of spring meant following the herds again. The buffalo returned, and so did the people. It wasn't random wandering, it was choreography perfected over generations. Each tribe had its roots, its landmarks, its agreements with others about who hunted where. There were boundaries, sure, but they were flexible, built on respect and balance. The goal wasn't to own the land, it was to belong to it without breaking it. Foraging itself was a full-time art. Take wild rice for example. The Ojibwe called it manamin, the good seed. It grew in shallow lakes and rivers, and when the time came, usually late summer, families would travel in canoes to harvest it. 2 people per canoe, one poling gently through the stalks, the other leaning over with 2 sticks, bending the rice heads and tapping them so the grains fell inside. You didn't take it all. Some had to fall back into the water to grow again next year. And when the rice was gathered, it wasn't eaten right away. It was dried, parched over fire, and threshed underfoot. A long process, done with care. Because food wasn't just calories, it was continuity. Let's drift south for a bit, to the deserts and canyons again. Here, foraging looked completely different. The people watched for the saguaro cactus blooms, a sign that the fruits were almost ready. The Tohono O'odham people would use long poles made from cactus ribs to knock down the fruit, collecting them in baskets. The red pulp was sweet and sun-hot, and it was made into syrup or fermented into ceremonial wine. Each harvest marked the beginning of the new year, not with fireworks or calendars, but with gratitude. The ritual wasn't about excess, it was about renewal. Travel for foraging wasn't just functional, it was social. People visited relatives, shared news, traded seeds, arranged marriages, and retold the old stories along the way. A journey to gather roots or berries might take days, but it was never lonely. You moved with others, laughed, sang, and rested under the same sky as your ancestors once watched. Let's imagine a summer camp in the northern woods. Smoke rises through pine branches. A few elders sit by the fire, quietly slicing strips of dried fish. A group of women returns from berry picking, baskets full of blueberries and choke cherries. Children run circles around everyone, sticky with juice, chasing dragonflies. The air smells like sap and sunlight. That's what daily life was like. No rush, no factories, no strict schedules. Just steady work and rest in equal measure. Food was stored carefully for winter. Meat was dried and mixed with berries and fat to make pemmican, a kind of early trail mix that could last for months. Corn was strung up in braids and hung in storage pits. Acorns were shelled, soaked, and ground into meal. Foraging was part of a long memory. Every person knew which plants to take, which to leave, and what each one healed or harmed. And then, of course, came the spiritual layer, because nothing existed alone. Plants and animals weren't seen as objects. They were people of another kind. Each had a spirit, a will, a story. Before gathering, many tribes offered something, a pinch of tobacco, a few words of thanks. The point wasn't superstition, it was acknowledgement. You were taking life to keep life, and that deserved respect. The same went for hunting. Among the plains peoples, before a buffalo hunt, the elders held ceremonies. Dancers wore buffalo hides, drums echoed the heartbeat of the herd, and prayers were said so that the animal's spirits would return. To outsiders, it might have looked theatrical, but it wasn't. It was the philosophy of balance turned into action. You couldn't just take, you had to give something back, even if it was only intention. Let's float to another corner, the Pacific coast again, where the salmon runs returned every year like clockwork. Entire communities revolved around those When the first salmon appeared, a ceremony was held. The first fish was caught, cooked, shared, and its bones carefully returned to the river, so the spirit would tell the others to keep coming. It sounds poetic, but it was also deeply practical. The ritual kept people from overfishing too early. Spirituality is environmentalmanagement.com, efficient and beautiful. And speaking of beauty, the tools of foraging were art in themselves. Baskets woven from willow or cedar bark, patterned with meaning. Each design told a story: mountains, rivers, stars. A woman could spend months weaving one, not for decoration, but because she understood that the object carrying food should also carry memory. It's easy to romanticize that kind of life. It wasn't all gentle peace. There were lean years, droughts, storms, and hunger. But what's striking is how little waste there was. Every part of a plant or animal had a use: sinew for thread, bones for tools, hides for clothing, fat for light. Even ashes were useful. When you live close to the land, you learn that nothing is disposable, not even the leftovers of fire. Let's pause again and think about that rhythm. Travel to gather, gather to survive, survive to give thanks. The year moved in circles, not lines. And when one cycle ended, it wasn't seen as loss, just a turning of the great wheel. At night, people gathered around small fires. They didn't just talk about what they'd found that day. They told why it mattered. Every berry and seed had a story. The elder might point at the stars and say, "That's where the salmon go when they leave the river." Or that plant grew from the tears of the first woman. Were those myths? Maybe, but they carried truth, the kind that keeps you gentle toward the world that feeds you. Now, as the days shortened and the air cooled, everything slowed. The travel became more cautious. You didn't stray far. Winter was coming, and with it, the long quiet. People retreated to winter lodges, insulated with earth or bark. The world outside went to sleep, and so did the land. Inside, families told stories, repaired tools, carved, sang. Time didn't stop, it just softened. Foraging, in that sense, wasn't only a way to eat. It was a way to stay connected to the earth, to the ancestors, to the idea that life is circular. When spring returned, the people would move again, following the melt, the bloom, the sound of the geese coming back. The same cycle, the same gratitude, every year. Let's drift out of that winter lodge now, step into the crisp morning, where frost glitters on the ground and breath hangs in the air. Somewhere, a child runs ahead on a familiar trail, leaving small footprints in the snow. The dogs bark, the adults laugh softly, and the sun begins to rise over the horizon. For them, this wasn't just travel, it was belonging. Every step, every path, every plant picked or animal hunted carried the same quiet message. You are part of this, not apart from it. And that's the spirit that ran through everything. Movement, gathering, living. The land wasn't scenery, it was family. A bond that can't really be explained, only lived. In the next part, we'll explore that spiritual world more closely, the ceremonies, the dreams, and the idea that even traveling through life itself was a sacred act. So take a slow breath, let the firelight fade in your mind. We'll walk into the world of spirit next. If you're still with me, just breathe a little slower, like you're settling by a campfire again. The stars are back out. The air feels thin and endless. Somewhere nearby, you can almost hear the sound of a drum, soft, steady, and distant, like a heartbeat under the earth. Tonight, we're stepping into the invisible side of native life, the world of spirit, dream, and ceremony. Because for most native peoples, there wasn't really a line between the seen and the unseen. Everything overlapped, the human, the animal, the land, and whatever waited beyond it. Let's start with something simple. Walking, travel, as we talked about before, wasn't just practical, it was sacred. When someone set out on a journey, they didn't just pack tools or food, they carried prayers. Movement itself was a kind of offering, a conversation with the land. You might stop at a stream, leave a stone or a pinch of tobacco, whisper a few words, then move on. Not because you expected anything, but because you recognized that the world noticed you walking through it. For many tribes, certain places were alive in ways others weren't. A mountain could be a relative, a spring could hold memory, a canyon might echo with the voices of ancestors. You didn't just pass through these places, you greeted them, you acknowledged them, the way you'd greet an elder before speaking. It wasn't superstition, it was relationship. The natural world wasn't a background for life. It was life. Let's float for a moment into the northern forests to the Ojibwe and Cree, where the dream world was as real as waking life. Dreams weren't random. They were messages, sometimes from spirits, sometimes from one's own deeper self. Young people might go on a vision quest, spending days alone in the wilderness, fasting, waiting for a dream or a sign that revealed their purpose. It wasn't a test of strength, exactly. It was more about listening, about being quiet long enough to hear what the universe had to say. If the vision came, maybe in the form of an animal, or a strange sound, or a dream that wouldn't fade, it became a kind of compass for the rest of their life. The person would return to camp, changed, and from then on, that animal or symbol became part of them, their spirit helper, something like a guide. In the plains, the relationship between humans and animals was especially deep. The buffalo wasn't just food. It was teacher, ancestor, and provider. Each part of it had purpose: hide for shelter, bone for tools, sinew for thread, horn for spoons. Even the breath of the buffalo, as it steamed in the cold, was said to carry prayers upward. When the people danced the buffalo dance or sang the old songs, it wasn't theater. It was gratitude in motion, a way of keeping the spirit of the animal close, ensuring the circle stayed unbroken. Let's wander west again to the Pueblos and Hopi, where the spirit world was woven into every ceremony. They believed the Kashinas, spirit beings that represented everything from clouds to ancestors, visited the villages through dancers wearing masks. Those dances weren't performances. They were collaborations between humans and spirits to keep the world in balance. Rain, harvest, health, all of it depended on the right relationships being honored. A Hopi ceremony might go on for days, the steady rhythm of drums echoing through adobe walls. dancers moving in time with the heart of the earth. Children watched quietly, learning the steps, the songs, the meanings, so that someday they could keep the balance. That's the quiet truth of most native spiritual life. It wasn't about faith in something distant. It was about participation in something constant. If you're imagining this as a world full of ritual and smoke and chanting, you're not wrong, but it wasn't solemn all the time. There was laughter, teasing, mistakes, and humor even in the sacred. Because spirit wasn't fragile. It didn't break if you smiled. Many stories about creation and the trickster, like Coyote or Raven, were full of absurdity and wit. They reminded people that even in a spiritual world, things could go wrong, and that was okay. The trickster made sure nobody got too serious. In the Great Basin, people told stories of Coyote doing everything wrong, stealing fire, ruining plans, and somehow still teaching everyone a lesson. It sounds funny, but it's wisdom disguised as comedy. It told people, yes, the world has order, but also chaos, and both are needed. Now, imagine how that view shaped travel and foraging. If every rock, tree, and animal had spirit, then every journey was full of conversation. A hunter might talk to the wind before setting out. A woman gathering roots might sing to the earth before digging. These weren't empty gestures. They were how you stayed in good standing with the universe. Let's drift north again, where the Haida and Tlingit carved totems that told entire histories. Each figure on a pole wasn't decorative. It represented a lineage, a story, a spiritual alliance. The carving itself was prayer, slow, deliberate, rhythmic. The hands that shaped the wood were guided by memory, not sketchbooks. The act of creation was part of keeping the spirit world visible. Everything about this world was built on reciprocity. You took, you gave, you asked, you listened. Even death wasn't an end, just another part of the circle. When someone passed, their spirit wasn't gone. It joined the land, the wind, the ancestors. People spoke of hearing them in dreams, or feeling them in the brush of a breeze. And when you think about it, that's a remarkably peaceful worldview, one where separation doesn't really exist. You're never truly alone, because the world around you is always full of company, even if unseen. Let's pause in that stillness. Imagine standing on a high ridge, watching clouds roll across endless plains. You can feel the wind pushing against your face, the sun fading behind the hills. Somewhere below, the campfire smoke rises in thin spirals. That moment, the quiet awareness of place was prayer. You didn't need temples or altars. The earth was both. It's easy, in a modern world of screens and schedules, to forget that kind of silence even exists. But for the people who lived this way, that silence was home. It wasn't empty, it was full. Now, within each tribe, these beliefs were passed carefully, through stories, songs, and dances. You couldn't just read them in a book. You had to feel them, participate in them. And that's why, even when colonization tried to erase native spiritual practices, they endured quietly in songs whispered, in dances performed in secret, in languages that refused to die. Because when your belief system is tied to the land itself, it can't really be erased, only hidden for a time. The land remembers. Let's drift now toward one last image for the night. A traveler, maybe a hunter, maybe a young woman gathering herbs, stops by a stream at dusk. She sets down her bundle, kneels, and touches the water. She whispers something, maybe to the spirit of the stream, maybe to herself. The reflection shimmers sky, trees, her face, all blurring into one. For a moment, everything is connected, human, earth, spirit. Then she rises, picks up her things, and walks on, leaving nothing behind but a faint ripple in the current. That's the quiet power of native spirituality. It doesn't demand attention. It just is. A constant conversation between the visible and invisible, between the walker and the path. And that S where we pause tonight, right on that edge between movement and meaning. In the next part, we'll explore how communities stayed connected through trade, travel, and story. How the roads between tribes carried more than goods. They carried ideas, art, and identity. For now, let your mind rest there, by that stream. The world is still, and the spirits are listening. You're already in the right mood. Tonight, we're going to move again, not through forests or over plains, but along the old roads of trade and story that once linked the continent together. Before colonization, North America was already a web, a living network of trails, waterways, and meeting grounds. You could start at the Atlantic coast, and through a chain of exchanges, end up with goods that came from the Pacific. No one called it globalization. It was just how life worked. Let's begin with the rivers, the first highways. They were the arteries of movement, carved deep into the land, long before anyone thought of boats. Canoes, dugouts, and rafts carried people, food, and stories. The Mississippi, the Missouri, the Columbia, these weren't barriers. They were invitations. The river valleys of the Southeast were full of life. The Mississippian culture, with its great mound cities like Cahokia, flourished centuries before Columbus. They traded shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rockies, and mica from the Appalachians. If you picture that, copper bracelets, carved pipes, exotic stones, you start to see how connected everything already was. A trader from the plains might bring bison hides to a village along the Mississippi. In return, he'd take corn, pottery, or ornaments back west. The goods themselves mattered, but what really traveled were stories: who made them, where they came from, what they meant. Trade wasn't just economics, it was diplomacy. You didn't just show up, barter, and leave. You shared food, songs, and sometimes families through marriage. That's how alliances were built, not with contracts, but with relationships. Let's wander north for a moment, to the Great Lakes, where birchbark canoes slid through calm water. The canoes themselves were marvels of engineering, light, flexible, and strong. A skilled builder could make one in days, using only a knife, an awl, and patience. Those canoes carried everything: fish, furs, food, and sometimes the hopes of whole families moving to new hunting grounds. At night, camps were made along the shore. Fires reflected on still water. You could probably hear someone singing quietly, not a performance, just a rhythm to keep company with the dark. Further west, the plains tribes traveled routes that followed the movements of the buffalo and the curve of the rivers. After horses arrived, stolen, traded, or captured from Spanish herds, travel changed forever. Horses expanded everything: hunting range, trade distance, even storytelling. Suddenly, a journey that once took a week could be done in a day. Tribes adapted fast. The Comanche, Lakota, and Crow became masters of mounted life, their mobility unmatched. But the horse also changed the rhythm of connection. Raids became more common, not just for resources, but for prestige. Trade could blur into conflict, and back again. Yet even through competition, the roads stayed open. Goods still moved. So did language, ideas, and songs. Let's glide up toward the northwest again. Along the Pacific coast, people traded obsidian, cedar, dried salmon, and decorative shells that traveled hundreds of miles. Some of the finest shell beads found in inland archaeological sites started near the ocean. That's a lot of carrying power. The potlatch ceremonies of the northwest coast were another form of connection. Massive gatherings where wealth was given away to build reputation. You didn't prove your power by hoarding. You proved it by giving. It was generosity as social structure. The opposite of the modern more is better mindset. Now, travel wasn't just for trade. It was for storytelling. Stories traveled just like goods passed from one nation to another, changing shape along the way. You might hear the same tale of a hero, a trickster, or a creation event told slightly differently across thousands of miles. The core stayed the same, but each retelling carried a local flavor: a familiar animal, a nearby mountain, a hint of home. Think of that, a continent connected not by written text, but by spoken word. And yet, somehow, the story never vanished. Some roads were purely spiritual. Pilgrimage sites existed: mountains, springs, canyons, where people came to pray or leave offerings. You might meet strangers along the way and recognize them, not by language but by the same respect they showed to the place. In the southwest, turquoise and shell jewelry linked desert people with coastal ones. The Hopi traded salt with their neighbors across miles of hard land. The ancestral Puebloans built roads, straight, geometric, and strangely precise, connecting their great houses like threads across the desert floor. You can still see them from above, faint lines that once carried footsteps and prayers. It's humbling to imagine how many feet wore those paths smooth. Hunters, traders, storytellers, children, thousands of years of movement, fading quietly under modern highways and towns. And yet, some of those trails survived, quite literally. The Natchez Trace, stretching from Tennessee to Mississippi, began as a native trail. The Iroquois paths through upstate New York became colonial roads, then highways. Even parts of Route 66 follow ancient tracks laid down by native travelers long before asphalt existed. So, when you drive today, across plains, through forests, past rivers, you're often following roads that remember older footsteps. Let's pause there for a moment. Picture the continent not as wilderness, but as a web of living roots, canoes moving along quiet rivers, riders crossing grassy horizons, traders walking dusty trails with bundles on their backs, and along every path, songs, always songs. Each road had its own rhythm, walking songs, paddling songs, traveling chants meant to keep time and courage alive. Trade wasn't the only thing moving. Knowledge did too. How to tan hides, how to weave baskets, how to find medicine in a leaf. Those lessons spread far. Designs in pottery in the Southwest echo patterns carved into wood on the Pacific coast. Coincidence? Maybe not. The continent was in conversation with itself. Even the spiritual ideas overlapped. Dreams as guidance. The four directions as sacred. The circle as symbol of balance. You could hear echoes of those beliefs thousands of miles apart, like variations on the same ancient song. Of course, not every encounter was peaceful. Some routes were watched, defended, or closed off during conflict. But even then, trade found a way. Humans always find ways to connect, even in tension. Now, let us float down to one of the great gatherings, a summer trade fair on the northern plains. Hundreds of tipis form circles on open grassland. Smoke rises, drums pulse softly, horses graze in the distance. People laugh, argue, trade, hides, beads, knives, herbs. You'd hear half a dozen languages at once, smell roasted meat and wild sage, and see faces painted for celebration, not war. This was the social network of the pre-colonial world, alive, noisy, human. And when night came, the drums didn't stop. The stories began. Travelers from faraway lands shared news of floods, hunts, dreams, or prophecies. Elders reminded the young that these meetings were more than business. They were what kept the world whole. Because connection, in the native worldview, wasn't just about trade or travel. It was about harmony between people and the land. When a trader arrived, you didn't just see what he carried. You saw the path that brought him there, the rivers, the animals, the ancestors who guided his way. Every exchange carried a trace of spirit. Every journey added a line to the map of memory. If you could look down from the sky back then, you wouldn't see nations divided by borders. You'd see threads, glowing trails stretching across mountains and plains, weaving everything together. A continent alive with movement. And maybe, in a quiet way, it still is. Every train track, every road, every hiking path today, they all trace something ancient underneath. It's easy to forget that. But the land doesn't. Let's end this part there, standing somewhere on that invisible network, hearing the soft murmur of an old trade song carried by the wind. In the next part, we'll settle closer to home into family life, community, and how people passed knowledge through generations without writing a single word. So for now, breathe easy. The roads are still there, just sleeping beneath the noise of modern life. Made it this far. You've traveled quite a distance across rivers, plains, and time itself. Now it's time to stop moving for a while. Tonight, we're going to step quietly into the center of native life, the home, the family, the circle that held everything together. Life in many native societies wasn't built around kings, palaces, or empires. It was built around balance, small, steady circles of people who understood that the world outside was just as alive as the one inside. There wasn't much need for hierarchy when survival depended on cooperation. So let's picture a camp at dusk. Smoke drifts from a low fire. The air smells faintly of pine and roasted meat. Children are chasing each other near the edge of the trees, while elders sit nearby, watching with the quiet patience that only comes from having seen it all before. The day's work is done. Food gathered, hides stretched, tools mended. It's not a place of luxury, but it's not a place of want either. There's rhythm here. Every person has a role, and every role connects back to something bigger. In some nations, homes were longhouses, long arched halls made of wood and bark, warm and dim, housing multiple families from the same clan. In others, homes were circular, tipis on the plains, dome-shaped wigwams in the northeast, or earthen lodges near the rivers. But no matter the shape, the idea was always the same. People together, in a circle, around a center of warmth and story. The fire in the middle wasn't just for cooking, it was a kind of heartbeat, the quiet pulse of home. You could measure the day by it: morning embers, midday flame, evening glow. When you live in a world without clocks, you start to sense time differently. The day's rhythm is written in the light, the sounds of birds, the taste of wind, and that's how it was here. Time wasn't a schedule, it was a relationship. In many tribes, children didn't belong only to their parents, they belonged to the whole community. An aunt or uncle might teach them to hunt or weave. An elder might tell them stories of the spirits. Each lesson wasn't just practical, it was cultural memory disguised as everyday advice. Don't waste what you take. Walk softly. Remember where your water comes from. Simple words, but each carried centuries of understanding. The home was a classroom, a place of learning by watching. You didn't sit at a desk, you learned by doing. How to set a snare, how to paddle straight, how to read the sky before a storm. And somewhere in between chores and play, children absorbed the unspoken lessons that the world doesn't revolve around humans, that animals, plants and rivers all carry spirit. That balance isn't something to achieve once, it's something to maintain every day. Let's drift into a winter evening. Snow is piled outside the lodge. The wind hums softly against the walls. Inside, it's warm and low-lit. Someone adds wood to the fire, and sparks leap up, scattering light over the faces gathered around. This is story time, the real heart of winter. When the land rests, people turn inward. The hunters repair tools, the weavers finish their baskets, and the elders begin to speak. The stories aren't read from books, they're remembered. They explain how things began, why the coyote tricks people, how the first fire was stolen, or why the stars move as they do. They mix truth, humor, and warning in a way that makes perfect sense if you listen closely. You can almost hear it, the slow rhythm of the storyteller's voice, the soft laughter when the trickster gets caught, the silence when something sacred is mentioned. The stories aren't entertainment, they're the operating system of the world. If you think about it, that's how knowledge survives when there's no paper. It's not written, it's lived. You remember it because you're part of it, because someday you'll tell it too. Now let's step outside again. The night is clear, the stars sharp and close. The Milky Way stretches above, and someone points. That's the path of spirits, they say. When we die, that's the road we take. The universe, to them, isn't distant. It's family. The moon watches. The wind listens. The trees answer. Everything is alive, and everything has a place in the circle. And that idea, the circle, appears everywhere. In the layout of camps, in the round shape of tipis, in the drum. It's the symbol of continuity. Birth, life, death, renewal. It's not a line that ends. It's a rhythm that keeps turning. When conflicts happened, councils were often held in circles too, so no one stood above anyone else. Leaders weren't chosen for wealth, but for wisdom, generosity, and the ability to speak with calm. The best leaders listened more than they talked. In many matrilineal societies, women held the power to decide land, family, and inheritance. They were the keepers of continuity, the living roots of the community. That might surprise people used to patriarchal systems, but to these societies, it was just common sense. Life comes through women. Therefore, balance comes through them too. If you stayed long enough in one of these villages, you'd notice how decisions took time. Not because people were slow, but because they cared about consensus. Every voice mattered, from the elders to the youngest who could speak. Patience wasn't weakness, it was respect. Now imagine the soundscape of home life. The scrape of stone tools, the hiss of roasting meat, children laughing, a low hum of someone singing as they grind corn. All ordinary noises, but together, they create something soothing, something timeless. Every small task, weaving, carving, tending a fire, was a form of prayer. You didn't need temples for devotion. You just needed attention. To do a job well was to honor the spirit in it. Food was part of that same rhythm. Meals weren't about abundance, they were about gratitude. Corn, beans, and squash. The three sisters grew together, supporting each other the way people did. Fish, game, berries, all taken carefully, with offerings left in return. There's a phrase that sums up this way of living. All my relations. It's not just about family, it means everything that exists. Human, animal, stone and star is connected. And when you eat, or hunt, or build, you acknowledge that web. In a world that often feels scattered and restless, there's something deeply steady about that. A reminder that home isn't a building, it's a pattern of care, repeated daily until it becomes sacred. Let's end this part where we began, at the fire. The flames are low now. The night has settled in. The children have fallen asleep, one by one. The adults sit quietly, listening to the crackle, watching the sparks rise and vanish into the dark. There's peace here, not silence. Exactly, just a quiet knowing that the circle holds. Tomorrow they'll travel again, or trade, or gather food. But tonight, everything they need is here. Home is not a place you keep. It's a way of being that keeps you. If you've been following along, you've traveled far through rivers, forests, plains, winter lodges, and fireside circles. Tonight, we linger longer in the quiet heartbeat of native life, spirit, ceremony, and the ways humans connected to everything beyond themselves. Ceremony was everywhere, not just in the grand seasonal gatherings, but in small, daily acts. Before eating, before hunting, before planting, offerings were made, words whispered, prayers sent. Sometimes it was smoke rising from a small bundle of herbs. Sometimes it was simply a nod to the sun. Every act of preparation, every careful motion, carried meaning. Travel wasn't separate from ritual. Walking along a trail, gathering roots, or paddling a canoe could all be acts of devotion if done with mindfulness. The land itself listened. Let's drift west for a moment, to the plateau region, where salmon runs defined life. People built small wooden platforms over streams to dry fish for winter. Before placing the first fish, prayers were said. The first salmon was often left to swim free, a gift to the river. It wasn't superstition. It was a reminder that survival depended on reciprocity. You took, but you gave back. You participated in a cycle larger than yourself. Some ceremonies were elaborate and scheduled around the seasons. The sun dance, practiced by plains peoples, was a central ritual. It could last several days, with singing, drumming, dancing, and fasting. Pain and endurance were often part of it, not as punishment, but as a form of focus. The body became a channel for attention, for vision, for connection to the spirit world. Across the continent, dances, masks, songs and costumes told stories of ancestors, animals, and cosmic order. Among the Hopi and Zuni, Kashina dancers wore masks, representing spirits of the rain, the sun, or the ancestors. Through movement, they embodied beings both visible and invisible. To watch was not entertainment. It was witnessing the world in motion, understanding it, and learning to participate respectfully. Even smaller communities held ceremonies for daily life: birth, first hunt, harvest, marriage, and death. Each was a microcosm of the larger spiritual rhythm. Every birth was celebrated not only as the arrival of a human, but as the continuation of the circle. Every death was honored, not as loss, but as transition, another step along the same path that all living things share. In the forests of the northeast, the Iroquois and Algonquin peoples practiced similar ceremonies, tied closely to the cycles of planting and harvesting. Corn was sacred. The planting and harvesting of the Three Sisters was a ritual as much as it was work. Before planting, offerings were made. Seeds were carried with care. The rhythm of the land dictated when to sow, when to weed, and when to harvest. The spiritual world wasn't distant or abstract. It wasn't a place over there. It was embedded in everything: the wind, the rain, the rocks, the animals, and the people themselves. Even ordinary acts like cutting a tree or hunting a deer carried spiritual weight. To do them carelessly risked imbalance. To do them mindfully brought harmony. Vision quests, as we've seen, were another way people interacted with spirit. Young men and women might spend days alone in the wilderness, fasting and seeking guidance. The goal wasn't glory, it was clarity, a connection to the forces that shape the world. Sometimes the guidance came as a vision, sometimes as a sound, an animal encounter, or a subtle sign. The lesson wasn't always literal. Often it was about perception, seeing your place in the circle of life. Let's pause in the northwest again. The totem poles carved by the Haida and Tlingit weren't just art. They were histories, prayers, and spiritual markers. Every animal figure, every symbol, told a story of ancestry, of connection to the land, and of obligations to the unseen. The act of carving itself was ceremonial. The wood, the tools, the hand, all participated in a rhythm that transcended the ordinary. Even death was revised. Bodies were buried with care, sometimes in trees, sometimes in mounds or hidden locations. Personal belongings might be included. Food, tools, or ornaments accompanied the journey. The spirit of the deceased remained part of the land and the community. Ancestors were not gone. They were present, in memory, in story, in dreams, in the wind brushing through trees. This is why storytelling, already a daily practice, became ceremonial too. Stories preserved knowledge, reinforced values, and taught lessons about morality, balance, and the consequences of choices. Trickster tales in particular reminded listeners that life is both serious and unpredictable. The humor softened the lesson, making it more memorable, and music, simple, repetitive, drumming, chanting, connected everyone in the circle. It wasn't background, it was a vessel for attention, a rhythm that aligned the human heartbeat with the pulse of the world. Even mundane acts, like repairing tools or tending the fire, carried ceremony. Doing these things with mindfulness, care, and attention to the spirits ensured that life remained harmonious. The sacred and the ordinary were inseparable. So let's float for a moment to the high plains, where a group gathers to celebrate a successful hunt. Meat is shared, hides stretched, bones carefully saved. Elders tell stories around the fire. Songs rise, echoing into the night. Everyone participates. No one is merely a bystander. Life itself is a ceremony, a quiet, continuous acknowledgement of connection, respect, and gratitude. As the night stretches on, think of the rhythm. Travel, forage, gather, rest, pray, repeat. It's not flashy or dramatic. There's no climax, no spectacle, just continuity. And there's a certain peace in that, in knowing your steps are part of a larger, living pattern. In the next part, we'll explore how these spiritual practices influenced art, language, and memory, how the stories, songs, and symbols tied everything together across time and space. For now, settle beside your imaginary fire, listening to the low rhythm of drums and wind. The world, like the people we've been following, continues its quiet, sacred motion. Traveling along, you've seen rivers, plains, forests, winter lodges, and fireside circles. Tonight, we linger on another thread of native life, the ways memory, art, and language carried culture, knowledge, and spirit across generations. One of the most striking aspects of native societies was how much was remembered without writing. Not because they were illiterate, far from it, but because memory itself was sacred. Stories, songs, ceremonies, and objects preserved knowledge in living form. Let's start with oral history. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were archives. They preserved lore, genealogy, hunting strategies, and spiritual guidance. A child listening to a story about a trickster or a creation myth was learning ethics, survival, and cosmology all at once. The story shaped the listener's understanding of the world. The repetition and rhythm of these stories made them easy to remember. A storyteller might repeat key phrases, emphasize certain gestures, or sing certain lines. Memory wasn't passive. It was active, performative, and communal. Everyone present reinforced the tale by listening, responding, or adding details. Now, let's drift toward art. Art in native cultures was never separate from daily life or spirituality. It lived in baskets, pottery, clothing, carving, tattooing, beadwork, and painting. Each design carried meaning, a reference to a clan, a spiritual idea, or a story passed down through generations. The Northwest Coast tribes, for example, carved totem poles with astonishing precision. Each figure represented ancestors, animals, or spirits, and the pole itself became a narrative. You could read a totem just as you would a story, learning who belonged to which family, what alliances existed, or what myths were remembered. On the plains, Parflish's rawhide containers were painted with geometric patterns. The colors, shapes, and arrangements weren't arbitrary. They encoded clan symbols, personal achievements, and sometimes maps of travel routes. Even objects made for daily use weren't devoid of meaning. Tools, utensils, and clothing often bore subtle designs, reminding users of history, family, or spirituality. Language, too, was deeply tied to observation and connection. Many native languages carry ecological knowledge within them. Names for plants, animals, rivers, and mountains often describe characteristics, uses, or seasonal changes. Instead of abstract labels, words were practical and descriptive. Saying a word was saying a whole story about place, survival, and relation. Consider counting and direction. Some languages don't just have numbers in isolation. Numbers exist relative to context, the seasons, the moon, the hunt. Directions are often referenced in relation to the landscape, the river bend, the rising sun, the mountain peak. The language is alive with the land itself. And then there's symbolism. Colors, patterns, shapes, and sounds were never neutral. Blue might evoke water, sky, or a spiritual state. Circles represented cycles and connection. Lines could indicate movement, travel, or ancestral paths. Music, too, encoded knowledge. Rhythms aligned with seasons. Drumming reflected ceremonial sequences. Even modern observers can trace these connections. Archaeologists can read pottery designs, carvings, and beadwork and see lineage, trade routes, and cultural continuity. The people themselves didn't need writing. Everything was encoded in lived experience. Memory, art, and language were reinforced through repetition and ceremony. A song sung at a seasonal gathering reinforced ecological knowledge, history, and spiritual lore. A dance enacted a story that could be remembered for decades. Objects acted as mnemonics, tangible aids that reminded people of the lessons, events, and relationships they needed to survive and thrive. Take the quipu of the Andes, for instance, though outside what we often call North America, and compare it to the knot systems in some native North American cultures used for record keeping. Knots, beads, and patterns acted as memory devices. Memory, in this context, was portable, physical, and communal. It didn't exist only in the mind but in the objects, songs, and stories that surrounded people every day. Even humor and the trickster figure played a role. Coyote, raven, and other tricksters weren't just comic relief. They reinforced cautionary tales, cultural norms, and ethics. The clever or mischievous acts in these stories reminded listeners to respect boundaries of people, animals, and the spirit world. Let's visualize a summer camp again. Children sit around a fire as elders tell a story about the first journey of the salmon. Hands gesture, voices rise and fall. Laughter punctuates a joke. The crackle of the fire punctuates suspense. A young listener remembers the path, the animals, the rivers, the lessons. Tomorrow, that child will retell it, perhaps adding her own observations. The story lives, grows, and continues. And art acts similarly. A basket with a pattern is more than decoration. It's a story, a memory, a guide for whoever looks closely enough to read it. The painter, weaver, or carver participates in a living archive, passing knowledge forward in tangible form. Even ritual connects to memory and art. Songs, dances, and objects anchor knowledge in repeated sensory experience. When drumming begins, the rhythm itself becomes mnemonic. Movements echo previous generations. Colors and designs evoke stories. The past and present exist simultaneously, connected through practice. By combining memory, art, and language, native peoples created a culture that could survive upheaval, migration, and even attempts at erasure. The knowledge wasn't fragile. It was woven into the fabric of life itself. And here's the remarkable part. This system wasn't hierarchical. Anyone could learn, anyone could teach, and everyone participated in maintaining it. Knowledge wasn't locked in texts or guarded by elites. It was shared, communal, living. Let's pause in that vision. You can almost see a child tracing the patterns on a basket, hearing the stories in the songs, learning directions from the names of hills, rivers, and stars. The world is a classroom. Every object is a teacher. Every journey is a lesson. Every song, a bridge between past and present. In the next part, we'll explore how these threads travel, foraging, spirit, home, and memory, interwove to create the full tapestry of daily native life. We'll look at work, play, relationships, and the quiet ways communities held themselves together. For now, let the image linger. Firelight flickering on a carved pole, the rhythm of a drum echoing softly in your mind, and the stories that never truly end. You've traveled rivers, plains, forests, homes, and the rhythms of spirit and memory. Tonight, we settle into the quieter but equally complex world of daily life, the routines, the labor, the joys, and the relationships that kept communities alive. Daily life was never rushed. There were no clocks dictating hours, only natural cycles. Sunrise, the shadow of the sun, the moon, the tides, the seasons. People woke with the light, worked with the rhythm of the land, and rested when it demanded. Let's imagine a morning in a village. Smoke rises from the lodges. Someone tends the fire while another grinds corn or acorns for the day's meals. Children imitate the adults, learning skills by watching and doing. Even play served a purpose: tracking, balance, coordination, social skills. Hunting and gathering weren't just tasks, they were immersive lessons. A hunter moved through the forest quietly, observing the patterns of the wind, the tracks of animals, the call of birds. A gatherer studied the seasonal rhythms of plants, when berries ripened, which roots could be harvested, which herbs carried healing properties. Foraging itself was spiritual, practical, and social. A woman collecting roots might sing softly, leaving an offering of tobacco or a small bundle to honor the earth. She wasn't alone. The process was guided by respect for life and awareness of the interconnectedness of all things. Work was almost always communal: carrying water, building shelters, tending crops, processing hides. These were shared responsibilities, and meals reflected that. Food was eaten together, often outdoors, with everyone contributing. Sharing wasn't optional, it was survival. Now, let's look at children. Children were allowed freedom to explore. Learning was experiential. Mistakes weren't punished harshly, they were instructive. You learned by doing, by observing, and by hearing the stories and wisdom of elders. Games often mirrored adult activities: tracking, aim, balance, strategy. The young practiced for future life while still enjoying the moment. Art and craftsmanship were part of daily life, not just ceremonial. Basket weaving, pottery, beadwork, and carving were taught from a young age. These objects served practical functions: storage, tools, clothing, but also expressed identity, clan affiliation, and cultural continuity. Even the patterns on a basket could tell a story about the maker's lineage or the land around them. Social life intertwined with work. Storytelling, song, dance, and ceremony happened alongside labor. A group might gather to process hides while telling stories that reminded everyone of proper behavior, spiritual lessons, or historical events. Nothing was purely work or purely play. Life blended both seamlessly. Marriage and kinship structured communities. Marriages often reinforced alliances, maintained balance between clans, or secured cooperation. But relationships weren't strictly transactional. Respect, care, and shared responsibility mattered deeply. Matrilineal societies, in particular, ensured continuity and guidance through maternal lines. Children belonged to the mother's clan, and women held authority in family and community decisions. Conflict existed, of course, but it was generally managed with counsel and discussion. Decision-making in many communities emphasized consensus. Leaders were chosen for wisdom, fairness, and generosity, not wealth or coercion. The focus was on long-term survival of the community, not short-term domination. Play and ceremony punctuated the routines. Seasonal celebrations marked harvests, solstices, or significant celestial events. Children and adults alike participated in dances, games, and rituals. These weren't distractions. They reinforced social bonds, spiritual beliefs, and collective memory. Meals, as always, were both sustenance and ceremony. Food preparation involved attention, ritual, and sharing. Corn, beans, and squash often appeared together, the three sisters each supporting the other, each symbolizing interdependence. Hunting or fishing brought similar practices: offerings, gratitude, and careful use of resources. Waste was minimal. Respect was maximal. Health and medicine were part of daily life. People used herbs, plants, and natural remedies for illness and injury. Knowledge of the land doubled as knowledge of the body. Shamans, or medicine people, acted as guides, healers, and spiritual intermediaries. Their role wasn't mysterious to the community. It was practical and essential. Even death was woven into daily rhythm. Bodies were cared for with respect. Ceremonies were performed, and memory was reinforced through storytelling, song, and symbolic acts. The deceased remained part of the community, not as absence, but as presence woven into the land, family, and memory. If you imagine all these threads work: travel, foraging, learning, play, ceremony, you begin to see how life was structured around balance and connection. Nothing existed in isolation. Every action, no matter how mundane, was part of a larger rhythm. So let's pause for a moment in that village. The fire burns low, Children curl up near the edges. Elders share stories quietly. Someone hums a tune while mending a basket. Outside, stars pierce the night sky. The wind carries distant animal calls. Everything feels connected, calm, and enduring. That's daily life. Not glamorous, not fast, not dramatic. Just steady, meaningful, alive. In the next part, we'll explore seasonal rhythms in detail, how migration, hunting, planting, and ceremonies created a yearly cycle that structured life from one generation to the next. If you've traveled this far, you've walked trails, paddled rivers, listened to stories, witnessed ceremonies, and settled into daily rhythms. Tonight, we follow the year itself, the seasons, and the natural cycles that shaped everything in native life. Life wasn't measured by calendars or clocks. It was measured by the sun, the moon, the stars, and the movement of plants and animals. Each season carried its own work, rituals, and opportunities for reflection. Let's start with spring. Spring was a time of renewal. Snow melted, rivers swelled, and young plants pushed through the soil. Hunters observed the first signs of animal activity. Gatherers looked for the earliest edible shoots. Spring wasn't just a season. It was a signal to prepare, to move, to pay attention. Planting began in many regions. Corn, beans, squash, and other staples were planted when the earth was ready, not a day earlier. People watched the weather, the soil, and even the behavior of animals to decide the right moment. Timing mattered. A crop planted too early or too late could fail, so intuition and observation were essential skills. Spring was also a time for ceremonies of renewal. Rivers and streams were honored as they swelled with meltwater. Animals were acknowledged for their survival and generosity. Communities might gather to perform dances, songs, and prayers to encourage abundance and balance. Summer brought longer days and warmer temperatures. Foragers moved through forests, gathering berries, nuts, and herbs. Hunters focused on the migrations and behaviors of game. Fishing reached its peak in rivers and streams. This was the season of abundance and activity, when the community was most mobile. People often traveled along familiar trade routes, visiting relatives, trading goods, and sharing stories. Summer was also festival season. Gatherings combined work and celebration. Children learned, adults traded, and elders shared wisdom. Music, dance, and story reinforced social bonds and spiritual connection. Every gathering was an opportunity to pass knowledge from one generation to the next, to maintain cohesion, and to honor the world that provided for them. Fall signaled preparation. Crops were harvested and stored. Animals were hunted for winter. Shelters were repaired, and fires prepared for the cold. There was a sense of focus and quiet urgency. Every action mattered. Missteps could have consequences, not just for one person, but for the whole community. Fall was also a season of gratitude. Harvest festivals and rituals gave thanks for survival and abundance. Offerings were made to spirits, acknowledging the land and the cycles that sustained life. Stories retold during this season reminded people of lessons learned and of ancestors who had walked the land before them. Winter brought the deepest stillness. Travel slowed. Hunting and foraging were limited. People stayed near fires, maintaining shelters and tending animals. Winter was a time of reflection, storytelling, and planning. Elders shared lessons. Songs and rituals kept the community's spirit alive during long, cold nights. Winter also emphasized resilience and patience. The cold was not just a physical challenge, it was a reminder of the interconnectedness of life and the need to work together. Communities survived by sharing food, labor, and knowledge. Children listened more intently. Adults observed carefully. Everyone understood that survival depended on cooperation and foresight. Throughout the year, each season carried spiritual significance. The cycles of the sun and moon, the movements of animals, the growth of plants, and the changes in weather were all reminders of the larger order. Humans were participants, not masters. The rhythm of life demanded respect, attention, and adaptation. Seasonal patterns also structured ceremonies. Vision quests might align with the solstice or a particular lunar phase. Harvest celebrations acknowledged both material and spiritual abundance. Winter dances honored ancestors and renewed spiritual connection. The calendar wasn't artificial. It was observed in practice, in the flow of daily life, and in the patterns of the natural world. Animals guided seasonal decisions. The appearance of certain birds signaled planting. The migration of deer guided hunting. The first run of salmon dictated fishing. Observing the land and its inhabitants was both practical and spiritual. Every creature was a teacher, every plant a sign, every change in weather a message. The seasonal cycle also reinforced communal cohesion. Work was often collective. Planting, harvesting, hunting, and preserving food required collaboration. Knowledge had to be shared, responsibilities rotated. Through this, children learned not only practical skills, but also cultural memory, the lessons, rituals, and ethics that defined their society. Even leisure and play were seasonal. Children might swim in rivers during summer, sled in winter, climb trees in spring. Games reflected adult tasks and taught observation, skill, and cooperation. Seasonal variation kept life dynamic while reinforcing rhythm. Each phase of the year had its purpose and its lessons. Let's pause and picture a winter night. Snow covers the plains. Fires burn low in lodges. Children are asleep near the warmth of elders. The wind moves across frozen rivers. Stories are told. Songs hum in the background. Even as the land rests, the community thrives in the quiet, maintaining memory, connection, and continuity until spring returns. Through these cycles, life remained balanced. No day was wasted, no season ignored. The world dictated pace, and people adapted with attention and care. The year was not an abstraction, but a living rhythm that guided work, play, travel, ceremony, and spirit. In the next part, we'll examine the broader networks of interaction, intertribal relationships, alliances, and the shared knowledge that connected communities across continents. You've traveled the seasons, experienced daily life, and immersed yourself in the rhythms of home and ceremony. Now it's time to widen the lens. Tonight, we explore the networks that linked native communities across vast distances, the alliances, trade, and shared knowledge that created a continent-wide web of connection. Before European contact, North America was already densely connected. Rivers, trails, and mountain passes served as highways, linking villages and nations. People traveled to trade, negotiate, attend ceremonies, and share knowledge. Long before maps existed, there was a living map of relationships. Trade was the lifeblood of these networks. Goods traveled vast distances, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains to the Great Plains, shells from the Gulf Coast to the northern forests, copper from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi Valley. But more important than goods were ideas, techniques, and spiritual practices. Knowledge traveled with traders as much as beads or furs. Let's imagine a trader leaving a village along the Mississippi. He carries baskets of maize, pottery, and carved ornaments. As he moves west, he encounters other communities. He observes how others process hides, shape tools, or prepare food. He exchanges stories of animals, weather patterns, and ritual practices. By the time he reaches a distant settlement, he has brought not only goods, but new ways of seeing, doing, and understanding the world. Diplomacy was another vital component. Alliances and treaties ensured peace or cooperation between neighboring nations. Councils were held in neutral places, often under the watch of elders and spiritual leaders. Agreements were remembered orally, reinforced by ceremony, and respected across generations. Breaking an agreement wasn't just dishonorable, it could threaten survival. Some alliances were formalized through marriage. A union might bind families or clans across territories, creating networks of obligation and shared responsibility. These relationships weren't just political, they reinforced cultural exchange and stability. Ceremony, too, crossed boundaries. Large gatherings brought together people from distant regions for seasonal festivals, trading fairs, and spiritual rites. During these events, songs, dances, and stories were shared, spreading knowledge far beyond a single village. Ritual practices evolved as different groups learned from one another, creating regional variations while maintaining shared meaning. Knowledge transfer wasn't limited to material or spiritual culture. Ecological knowledge, like the timing of plant harvests, animal migrations, or weather patterns, was communicated across regions. Techniques in pottery, weaving, toolmaking, and architecture spread widely, adapted locally, but retaining core principles. This ensured efficiency and survival, especially in areas with limited resources. The movement of people reinforced networks. Seasonal migrations, hunting trips, and exploration all connected communities. Even conflict had its place in the system. Raids or territorial disputes often ended with negotiation, exchange, or integration. The networks were resilient, flexible, and maintained by mutual recognition of benefit and respect. One fascinating example is the spread of the bow and arrow. Invented in one region, its use and refinement traveled hundreds of miles, altering hunting strategies, defense, and even social structures across multiple nations. Tools, techniques, and innovations rarely remained isolated. They spread through observation, trade, and apprenticeship. Language also facilitated intertribal connection. While many distinct languages existed, trade languages or pidgins allowed communication across regions. Even when words differed, shared gestures, symbols, and practices ensured understanding. Knowledge was portable, adaptable, and widely accessible. Storytelling played a role as well. A tale about a trickster or creation could cross rivers, mountains, and forests, carrying moral and practical lessons far from its origin. Variations emerged regionally, but the core wisdom remained intact, creating a shared cultural memory. Spiritual practices also traveled. Ceremonies, dances, and songs were observed, and sometimes adopted or adapted by neighboring groups. Sacred objects or motifs might be replicated across communities, creating a sense of shared identity and understanding. Networks were reinforced by observation and curiosity. Young hunters, travelers, and apprentices carried knowledge from one place to another. Artisans exchanged techniques. Shamans compared rituals and remedies. Even casual social visits contributed to the flow of information. Let's imagine a winter trade gathering in the northern plains. Hundreds of people arrive from various nations. Horses, sleds, and canoes carry goods and provisions. Fires burn in circles as children run between tents. Elders recount history. Hunters demonstrate techniques, and artisans display crafted goods. Stories are told, alliances reinforced, and knowledge exchanged. By the time everyone returns home, the seeds of innovation, adaptation, and cultural continuity have spread across the landscape. This was a continent alive with connection, not uniform, not centralized, but intricately linked by shared experience, observation, and respect. Even without writing, maps, or formal institutions, communities maintained memory, practice, and cooperation on a continental scale. And this network of interaction was more than practical. It was social, spiritual, and ecological. Relationships ensured survival, ceremonies maintained balance, and knowledge preserved continuity. People understood that their actions affected distant neighbors, that the web of life extended far beyond immediate surroundings. So if you picture the continent at this time, imagine a vast, living map, not drawn on paper, but traced in footsteps, canoe wakes, drum rhythms, smoke signals, and songs. Trails crisscrossed forests and plains. Rivers connected distant communities. Stories, skills, and spirit traveled alongside goods. It's a system of connection that modern society can barely grasp. Decentralized, resilient, and remarkably sophisticated. The native world was neither static nor isolated. It was dynamic, relational, and constantly in motion, shaped by both land and human ingenuity. As we end this part, take a moment to imagine the continent alive with movement and knowledge. Traders walking quietly along trails, children listening to stories by fires, canoes gliding through rivers, songs echoing across valleys. Knowledge carried in objects, words, and rhythms, ensuring the survival and flourishing of communities for generations. In the next part, we'll focus on art, symbolism, and the material culture that preserved identity, belief, and memory across generations. So far, we've traced the rhythms of travel, foraging, home life, ceremony, memory, and intertribal networks. Tonight, we linger over the tangible expressions of culture, art, symbolism, and material culture, the objects and creations that carried identity, story, and spirit across generations. Art in native life wasn't decoration for decoration's sake. Every object had meaning, function, and often multiple layers of significance. A basket might store food, yes, but its patterns could tell a story about family lineage, clan symbols, or the journey of its maker. A carved stone might mark a sacred site or commemorate a great hunt. Let's start with carving. Across the continent, wood, stone, and bone were carved with astonishing skill. Totem poles on the northwest coast illustrated ancestral spirits, clan identity, and historical events. Each figure, each angle, each placement was deliberate. Reading a totem pole was like reading a history book, only it was living, visual, and spiritual at once. On the plains, buffalo hides were painted to record personal achievements, visions, or historical events. A warrior might display a story of a successful hunt, a battle, or a vision quest. The hide was a canvas, the symbols were language, and the act of painting was both memory and prayer. Pottery is another example. In the southwest, Hopi-Zuni and Puebloan artisans created vessels with intricate designs. Each line and shape reflected cosmology, clan affiliation, or a story passed down for generations. But pottery was functional too, storing water, corn, or ceremonial offerings. Form and meaning existed together. Beadwork and quillwork were equally symbolic. Patterns could identify clan, denote status, or invoke spiritual protection. Colors weren't chosen arbitrarily. Blue might represent water, red might signify life or blood, and white could signal purity or connection to the spiritual world. Even clothing carried layered significance. Decorations, fringe, and sewn symbols were not only aesthetic but also communicative. A cloak could indicate accomplishments, social role, or affiliation. Masks used in dances could embody spirits, teach lessons, or mark seasonal ceremonies. Let's not forget the musical instruments. Drums, flutes, rattles, and whistles were tools of both expression and ritual. The beat of a drum might accompany a hunt, a dance, or a prayer. Instruments weren't merely sound makers. They were carriers of spirit and rhythm. Symbolism pervaded everyday life. Circles represented cycles of seasons, life, and the cosmos. Spirals might indicate growth or continuity. Animal motifs served as reminders of traits, lessons, or ancestral connections. These symbols were not static. They were interpreted contextually, keeping culture fluid and alive. Even utilitarian objects carried this layered meaning. Tools, cooking vessels, and shelters often bore designs that connected them to spiritual understanding. A paddle carved with patterns wasn't just a paddle. It was a piece of culture in motion, a story moving across rivers. Storytelling and symbolism intertwined with material culture. A carved item could spark a story. A patterned basket could evoke teachings. Objects became mnemonic devices, physical reminders of ethical lessons, genealogies, and ecological knowledge. Consider ceremonial regalia. Feathered headdresses, intricately beaded garments, and decorated staffs were more than display. They embodied authority, spiritual connection, and communal identity. Wearing them was a ritual act, a physical manifestation of social, spiritual, and historical knowledge. Patterns and motifs often traveled across regions through trade and interaction, blending aesthetics and shared understanding. The same symbol might appear in distant communities, adapted slightly, retaining a core message. This created continuity across space and time, tying distant peoples together in shared understanding. Art also mediated relationships with the environment. Carved figures, painted vessels, and woven patterns frequently represented animals, plants, or natural phenomena. These were not just representations, they were reminders of interdependence. Respect for the land, its creatures, and its spirits was encoded in material culture. Even funerary objects reflected this principle. Personal belongings, tools, or ornaments buried with the dead ensured continuity. They carried memory, identity, and guidance for the next phase of existence. Life and afterlife were connected through objects as much as through story or ceremony. Through art, symbolism, and material culture, native communities recorded and transmitted their worldview. Knowledge was preserved, not in books but in living, functional objects imbued with meaning. A basket, a carved pole, a painted hide, or a drum wasn't inert. It was part of a network of memory, spirituality, and daily life. Let's pause in a southwest village. Pottery cools in the sun. Children trace the patterns with their fingers. Elders tell the story embedded in the design. A drumbeat echoes in the distance, punctuating lessons learned. Every object participates in life, memory, and story. Nothing is separate, and everything communicates. This is the essence of material culture, a practical object, a symbol, a teacher, and a repository of history all in one. It's a quiet sophistication, a living archive, and a reminder that culture is carried not just in words but in hands, eyes, and hearts. In the next part, we'll explore the legacy of these practices, how they shaped continuity, resilience, and adaptation even in the face of upheaval. change, and the arrival of outsiders. If you've traveled all this way, you've walked trails, paddled rivers, observed ceremonies, traced seasons, witnessed trade networks, and examined the objects and art that carried culture. Tonight, we pause to reflect, not on dramatic events or battles, but on the quiet, enduring rhythms that shaped native life and its broader lessons. Life, as we've seen, was measured not by clocks or written records, but by attention, observation, and relationship. Every step, every act of care, every story, every song was part of a larger web, a network of people, land, animals, and spirit. From travel and foraging to ceremony and craft, there was a continuity and a balance. Humans were participants, not masters. The land provided, the seasons guided, animals taught, elders instructed, and children learned through doing and observing. This perspective challenges modern assumptions of efficiency, productivity, and ownership. Here, value wasn't extracted from the land, it was maintained in harmony with it. Knowledge wasn't hoarded, it was shared, practiced, and adapted. Identity wasn't just individual, it was communal, ecological, and spiritual. Art, storytelling, and ceremony reinforced this understanding. A carved pole, a basket, a song, or a dance wasn't ornamental or trivial. It was functional, mnemonic, ethical, and spiritual. Each object, action, and rhythm connected people across time and space. Travel, foraging, and seasonal migration weren't just survival strategies. They were ways of participating in the world. Walking trails, paddling rivers, tracking game, observing plants. All these activities were forms of engagement with the land, community, and spirit. Each act carried meaning, responsibility, and reflection. Even hardship was met with adaptation. Challenges of climate, displacement, or conflict required creativity and cooperation. The focus was less on conquest and more on continuity. Survival wasn't individual, it was relational. The intertribal networks we explored show that no community existed in isolation. Trade, diplomacy, marriage, and shared ceremony created resilience. Knowledge traveled with people, goods, and stories. Culture was flexible yet enduring. Legacy, then, is not only about survival. It is about memory, continuity, and perspective. It is about knowing how to live in relation to the world, to land, animals, ancestors, and community in ways that endure across generations. As we draw near to the end of this long reflection, consider the rhythms we've traced. Movement across the land, following rivers, mountains, and animal paths. Gathering, foraging, hunting, and preparing sustenance with care and ritual. Observing the cycles of seasons and aligning life with their rhythm. Creating, carving, weaving, and painting with meaning, memory, and beauty. Storytelling, singing, dancing, and ritual as a means of preserving knowledge. Traveling, trading, and connecting with other communities to maintain shared wisdom. Passing down this knowledge through practice, observation, and teaching. All of these threads come together to form a fabric of human life that is patient, continuous, and quietly profound. It is not flashy, it is not dramatic, it does not rely on spectacle, it relies on attention, care, connection, and respect. As you imagine these communities under sun, moon, and stars, think of the quiet persistence of life. Fires burning in lodges, canoes sliding down rivers, children learning through play and observation, elders telling stories, hunters moving silently through forests, craftspeople shaping tools and art, songs echoing across the plains. The world moves on, but these rhythms endure a lesson in balance, resilience, and perspective. Even in our modern world, there is something to learn from the attentiveness, care, and continuity of these lives. So, as you settle in, perhaps near a warm light or quiet corner, let the rhythm of this reflection carry you. Slow, observant, connected, mindful. Think of the cycles of the year, the stories told by fires, the songs of ancestors, and the ways human life intertwines with the land and spirit. There is no dramatic climax, no final revelation. Instead, there is continuity, there is understanding, there is a gentle, patient heartbeat that carries culture, memory, and life across time. And in that quiet, enduring rhythm, the story of native life, travel, foraging, ceremony, art, community, and legacy continues to live. Sleep well tonight, if sleep is part of your plan. And remember, History isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple and profound as walking through the world with attention, care, and connection.